My name is Jonathan Lynn and I'm a criminal defence solicitor at Hudson Morgan Williams. I've been a defence lawyer for about 20 years now. Not necessarily. Up until February 2008, if you simply had an employee who turned out to be an illegal immigrant or an overstayer or something, then simply by employing that person you had committed an offence. But since 2008 the position has changed a bit. Now you have to know. You're only guilty of a criminal offence if you know that you're employing an illegal immigrant or an overstayer or someone who's not entitled to work. State agencies like this, there's a civil penalties procedure and the alternative of prosecutions in the criminal courts. The offence is under Section 21, the criminal offence under Section 21 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And you commit an offence if you employ someone knowing that the employee is an adult subject to immigration control and that they are not legitimate, is probably the simplest way of putting it. There's a more serious offence if the police and the Crown Prosecution Service think that you're involved in people smuggling. That's a whole different level of seriousness. Well, under the civil penalties procedure, if there's an investigation, the border agency may well prefer to go for a civil approach rather than a prosecution. They might well think they'll find it difficult to prove that an employer knew that an employee was someone not entitled to work, and therefore they'll go along the civil route. There's a kind of a set procedure really they follow, but essentially what they're looking for is to see whether any checks were carried out, whether any documents were obtained, whether the documents were checked properly, and whether they were retained. That's really what they're looking to see, and that the employer has been responsible from their point of view. They're also looking out for things like how the employer reacts to the involvement of the border agency, and if you have had procedures in place to protect yourself a bit and just haven't done them properly, and you've been cooperative, you'll get a lesser fine than £20,000. There is all this stuff is available online at the border agency website if you want to go and have a look. But there are tables and which are very clear. You can work out quite clearly what sort of fine you would get depending on how you reacted to the involvement of the border agency. Yeah, in the criminal courts, the prosecution have got to prove that you knew. In a proper criminal court, the maximum sentence in the magistrates' court is 6 months imprisonment. In the Crown Court, it's 2 years. You'd be very unlucky to get 2 years imprisonment for an offence under this particular section. But if you haven't carried out proper checks, if you've simply turned a blind eye to everything, or if the documents you look at have pictures of people other than the people you're employing, then the prosecution might be successful. Lawyers talk about there always being two elements to a crime. There's the mental element, and there's the actual act of doing the crime. So, for example, if someone steals something, they don't just have to take something, they have to be dishonest and mean to keep it as well. So the act of taking is the act, and the keeping it and the dishonesty is the mental element. In this crime, the mental element is that you have to know. But just because you might think, well, how can they know what's in my mind? How can they possibly know what I know? Well, they will try and infer from circumstances around it. They'll look at the documents you've kept, they'll look at how many people you've employed. And don't forget, there's always the risk that your employees may decide to give evidence against you. Yes, there can be, if they think you're not just an employer who's employing legal immigrants, but that you are part of a people smuggling operation, then you're in a far, far more serious situation, and the potential sentences are much higher. This is an area where people who can get into trouble, small businessmen can get into trouble. It's something you should take very seriously, and it's actually quite easy to avoid getting into trouble. You've got to think there's a three-step process. You have to have a process to stop yourself getting into this trouble. Otherwise, you're going to run a risk. What you have to do is this. It's 3 stages. You have to, 1, get the documents from the people you are employing or about to employ. you have to check. You have to check those documents. Make sure they are legitimate documents. Make sure they're not obvious forgeries. Make sure it's got the right name and the right image on it, that sort of thing. And then you need to keep a record of the checks you've done and a record. You've got to keep copies of the documents you have looked at. And you've got to do this to protect yourself. And this isn't just necessarily a once and for all process. Some people have permission to work that expires. And if you're in that situation, you've got to have a procedure in place to check when their permission expires. You've got to be in a position to check they've got a new permission. Otherwise, you can end up committing the offence, even if you did all the checks when you took them on. This is something where you might want legal advice. We, lawyers here would be able to help you and help you set up a procedure that would protect you from the risk of a £20,000 fine or a prosecution. And if you do get into trouble with this sort of thing, you do need legal advice.